everybody. We are going to get started in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to go ahead and kick things off and let you guys join. So we'll give everybody just a couple of minutes before we get started. Okay, we have everybody, we have a couple people still joining and getting logged on, so we're going to give everybody about 45 more seconds and then we'll get started today. Okay, looks like we have quite a few people that have joined, so we'll go ahead and get started today. Steve from Amplify, if you're there, if you can't hear me or see me, just send me a text so I make sure that I clear things up. But we're excited to have you all join us this afternoon or evening if you're on one side of the United States, afternoon if you're on the other. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us as we kind of dive in a bit to mCLASS and think through the lens of the power that is behind the art of teacher observation and how that art then provides us with actionable data that we need to inform instruction. So we're excited to spend the next 45 minutes or so with you guys. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started and jump in. If you guys you can send chat. Some of you are already doing that. Gretchen, hopefully the echoing stops. Sometimes if you mute your computer there's a way that you can mute on your side or lower the volume a bit. That sometimes helps a bit. If it doesn't get better, let me know and I'll stick my headphones in, and sometimes that will help as well. So please let me know, Gretchen. But as you guys are working through, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can send me a chat via the chat button that's part of your on your control panel. You guys can send questions to the Q&A. There's a Q&A button and you can send questions there. But I would love for you to interact as much as we can on a webinar, interact as much as we can by ask questions throughout, and then we'll definitely have some time at the end to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. We'll spend the last about 10 minutes doing that. Let me know where you're from. I always love to hear where all of you are located. So I'm Emily Lutrick, and I live in Texas, just north of Dallas, about half an hour. I work for Allen ISD Independent School District, and I am the ELA and Dyslexia Coordinator, Elementary ELA and Dyslexia Coordinator for the district. Also, I'm an adjunct professor for Texas A&M University Commerce, and then a strategic advisor for Amplify, and have been in different roles and capacities for the last 12, 13 years as Amplify has helped support our nation for that many years. So continue to do that work, and I'm excited to kind of take all of those different hats that I wear at different times of the day and put them together to help support you guys as you registered for this and are interested in mCLASS, and in particular the power of teacher observation and how mCLASS supports that. So hi Gretchen, hi Susan from Anchorage. Interesting story, my mother actually has a cabin right outside, well, Lake Louise, 4 hours north of Anchorage, but I've been to Alaska, if you can imagine. Brenham, Texas, hi Sheila, nice to see a Texan on there. And then Steve, of course, from New York. Happy to see you again. Haven't seen you in person in a long time. So Carol, I saw you joined. Ronka, one of my very dear friends from a long time ago. So happy to see your name joined today. Libby from North Carolina, hi, welcome. I'm so excited that you guys are here. Hi, Carol. It's such a joy to get to see some friends and hopefully meet some new people today too. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. We'll get started. Like I said, we'll spend about 30 minutes on the content and then leave some time for Q&A and hopefully wrap up a little bit early, as I know it's late in the evening for those of you that are on certain parts, live in certain parts of the United States. So here's our agenda for today. I want to frame our conversation today around the power of teacher observation around two people, Emma and Mrs. MacArthur. And then we want to tie those two individuals back to kind of the big picture behind the power of teacher observation and why that data is critical when we're making instructional decisions for early readers and writers. Then we're going to link that to something that's helping us frame conversations with practitioners is addressing the action gap, and we'll kind of describe what the action gap is, how mCLASS supports that, and what that really means in terms of practice in our classrooms each and every day. And then we'll end with a Q&A. So that's the big idea, and we'll jump right in. So I want you to first meet Mrs. MacArthur. Mrs. MacArthur is a second grade teacher, and she has a full classroom, 25 unique students that she immediately, right at the beginning of the school year, needs to know a lot about. Here's Emma. Emma is a second grader in Mrs. MacArthur's class. She loves school, and she dreams of one day becoming an astronaut. What's interesting about this story is Emma, 3 weeks into the school year, Mrs. MacArthur was able to know a lot about Emma through observing her, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But these are the kinds of things she was able to know. She was able to know, Mrs. MacArthur was able to know that Emma, right off the bat, she loved reading. She's mastered decoding some short words with familiar patterns. She was having a harder time decoding unfamiliar words. She is an at-risk reader. She's also at risk for dyslexia. And she needs to be working on things like R-controlled vowels, words with consonant digraphs, words with vowel digraphs and diphthongs and variant vowel digraphs. She knew all of this information very quickly within the first 3 weeks of school. So that's a lot to know about a struggling student, but how powerful is that Mrs. MacArthur knows that about Emma and knows that she needs to do something about it. So I want you to hang on to this picture of Mrs. MacArthur and Emma throughout our time together, the next half hour or so, because we're going to keep circling back to why and how this is critical information and what it's going to mean for Emma long-term as a reader and just as a growing, educated student in our public ed system in the United States. So before we go there, let's kind of pause and think about why is it important that Mrs. MacArthur knew all of this information about Emma right off the bat. 3 weeks into the school year, she was armed and ready to go. So I want to go back to just some foundational basics, some research that I think sometimes as we've gotten as research becomes important and it becomes something talked about, then we stop talking about it. And so what I'm finding a lot of times, not only with undergrad and graduate students through the university work that I do, but also just in reality as a professional that works with practitioners, we sometimes start to forget why it's important that we do the things we do. So starting early, let's first talk about that. Starting early changes outcomes for kiddos. We know that reading difficulties start well before third grade or can. And we also know that it's absolutely our responsibility, and we have the ability to identify potential reading problems early and take care of that through appropriate intervention before they start to really struggle beyond the point that where it's going to take much more time to close that gap. Additionally, a couple of other key points that I like to highlight is we know that we have an issue, even though we've been talking about about reading success of our students for many years, many years. I won't even go into how long. We still have a problem with helping our students across the board be able to read proficiently at certain points in their educational career. In 2017, NAEP reiterated this through the information that they published, which was that at that time, only 37% of our fourth graders were scoring proficient in reading or better. At this point, once you have a student that's struggling, what we also know is that these students, once they hit that point of third or fourth grade where they're struggling, they're going to continue. It's going to take many years for them to catch up, and most of their time in school is going to be just doing that, trying to catch up. Some of these students will end up being identified at a later date with a learning disability that we can remediate. Too many times these students end up dropping out of school. So it's very critical that we identify these students early, prior to third grade if possible, and remediate effectively with structured literacy activities to help these students close the gap. This is a visual. Carol and I have been using this visual around the nation for many years as we've gone to talk to educators around the nation about literacy practice. But I like this visual because it helps really establish trajectories, and a literacy trajectory can be established and is established very early on in a student's academic career. And what's interesting is those trajectories really do stabilize. So for students that are on track, that's a great thing, but students that are not on track, it's not good to have a stable trajectory. We want that trajectory to change. We want these students that are on that lower 10% trajectory that you see on your screen in red, we want them to be moving up. But without early intensive intervention, struggling readers will not catch up to their average performing peer. The gap actually just begins to widen. Early intervention for these students is critical. And I'm happy to send you the massive amounts of research that back this up. I won't go into details today, but if you're a research junkie like myself, I'm happy to let you know where all this research comes from. But I think this is a really powerful visual. We need to, if you notice at the beginning of grade 1, the gap between the two trajectories is very small there. The green and red are almost overlapping. That's our time. We got to hit hard. We've got to intervene early, because then by the time they hit beginning of second grade, you see that trajectory just starts to widen and widen. And then by fourth and fifth grade, we have a pretty significant gap that is going to take a lot of time to remediate to get kiddos where they need to be. And then when it comes to this is if you talk to educators and practitioners around the nation, you know, we talk about these things. We talk about that we've got to catch kids early, and that we know by third grade, fourth grade, it's really critical that we identify those students at risk, and we close their gaps, and we intervene appropriately. But I think what we need to continue to talk about is that we know this, but what we still continue to sort of find is that there's an action gap. So what is that disconnect between research and practice? We know that this is what it takes, but for some reason, we have an action gap, and that we need to be figuring out what is a way that we can support practitioners from taking that research and doing something about it and getting it implemented into their daily practice in one way or another, while knowing that our practitioners in the United States right now have a ton on their plates, a ton of responsibility, and a really critical job, as they always have. So let's take a minute, and we're going to talk specifically about how mCLASS supports teachers like Mrs. MacArthur that you just met in taking action to close that action gap, so students like Emma can become astronauts someday. mCLASS in particular is going to help us not only address the action gap. We don't have time to waste. We've got to be able to take action for students that are at risk quickly. We want to be able to close those gaps and close them fast. And so mCLASS is one of the methodologies, or one of the set of tools that we can use to help us effectively transition that research into not only policy, but also practice. So let's think back real quick to Emma. And I started by describing Emma Emma's a second grader. Mrs. MacArthur knew a lot about Emma very early on in the school year. She knew some very specific things that Emma was going to need in order to close the literacy gaps that had formed for her. But how did she know all of that so quickly? That's where mCLASS really enters the picture. mCLASS allows Mrs. MacArthur the ability to do some things in a little bit of a different way. And first and foremost, mCLASS is going to allow Mrs. MacArthur to listen and watch Emma interact with text, identify letters, and read words. She's going to be able to observe Emma demonstrating these reading behaviors while screening her for literacy and for reading difficulties. Not only screening for basic reading difficulties, but also reading difficulties associated with things like dyslexia. So when you think about observation, Drummond, I think, I put this quote on here, I'll give you just a second to read it. Okay, so observation, what does it really mean? We just looked at, or I just explained that mCLASS is sort of unique because Mrs. MacArthur was able to actually watch and learn from Emma as she was interacting with text, and somehow was able to get all of that glorious information about Emma. But let's talk a bit about observation here. So I put a picture up here, the Eiffel Tower. I want you to think about the Eiffel Tower in Paris. I've never been, but I can Google Eiffel Tower, and when I Google it, I can learn quite a bit about it, right? I can get a sense of its stature. I can get a sense of its magnificence. I can get a sense of how tall it is. I've had a friend that's gone to visit, and she was able to FaceTime me from the foot of the Eiffel Tower so I could see it live. But in reality, absolutely nothing from what I hear, and this can apply to many, many things in life, but nothing can replace actually seeing the Eiffel Tower in person, observing the structure. Observation is critical in a lot of different ways when it comes to how we know what we know about our students and what we do for them every day. The teacher is at the center of that, right? So research and journals told us a bit about what it means to administer screenings and screening tools and assessments online. And generally, when it comes to risk, lots of us administer online assessments. We have a child on a computer and administer assessments that way. And mCLASS, we'll talk more about this in a minute, allows you to do that as well. But we still stand behind that it's really critical to observe a student interacting with the things that you're asking them to demonstrate mastery of. And generally, research does support that. So if you think about the research around what is the best methodology for administering assessments, you're going to find research that supports both putting a kid on a computer and assessing that way, and also teacher administered observational assessment. Both can give you accurate data. Online administered assessments can save a lot of time, and it's really powerful. The way that you can collect data, observational assessments can really get down to the granularity and allow educators to understand specific skills that teachers need. So there's, you can find research that kind of supports both, but the power of observation is something quite rare, and being able to bottle up what you're observing and have actionable data around that, I think is something that we need to focus on. So we are going to work through, I think I have 6, if it was 5, or maybe I think I added one more late last night, 6 myths around what it means to have a teacher administered assessment for a screening tool to identify risk, and how that data supports educators in making instructional decisions for their students. And so when I talk about teacher administered assessment, I'm referring to observational assessment. What does that mean? What does it look like? And we're going to talk through 6 myths associated with that to kind of help frame the power of teacher observation. So I want to talk through these 6 myths and keep thinking back to Mrs. MacArthur and how she was able to know so much about Emma so fast as we try to debunk some of these myths. Before I go into the myths, Any questions so far? I'm going back to my Q&A. I'm seeing a lot of people join and tell me where they're from, and I appreciate that. Not seeing any major questions so far. Good. You guys just keep adding things in, and some of the questions that are in there I will address as we're going through the myths, so I'm going to pause on those for a second. Okay, so thinking about observation and teacher-administered assessments, myth number one, teacher-administered assessment is administered via paper and pencil. So think just a second about what that means. Does it mean when a teacher is observing a student and collecting data for screening purposes, for formative assessment purposes, whatever it may be, does that have to be administered via paper pencil? Should have done maybe a true or false here, you guys, but we're going to stick with the myths. That is a myth. So with mCLASS, teachers are able to administer observable measures. Like we talked about, Mrs. MacArthur was able to sit next to Emma and listen to her read and listen to her interact with text and listen to her decode unfamiliar words. But she was doing that through the power of technology and mCLASS. So let me show you kind of what that would look like. I'm going to pop this up on my screen so we can walk through the actual experience here. But with Mrs. MacArthur, she was able to log into the mCLASS platform, and she's able to, at a glance, she's able to see whether it's for benchmarking purposes when you're screening 3 times a year or for ongoing progress monitoring, she's able to see at a glance who in her class she's already completed things for, and then who she needs to go in and continue or needs to assess. So we're going to look at Emma, because that's the student we've been focusing on. And she's able to see very quickly, without fumbling through papers or anything like that. Again, this is all on a device, on a mobile device. She's able to see that for Emma, she's done a couple of the assessments. She must have stopped and paused, and now she's coming back, and it's time for her to assess this particular measure. She'll then have all the administration rules and reminders that she needs to be able to effectively administer these assessment measures. So the mCLASS platform will explain to her, here's some reminders that you need to ensure administration fidelity. She's then going to be prompted with exactly what she needs to do for the student. She's going to be prompted that she needs to put a piece of paper in front of the kiddo. So for instance, back here, I showed you, we have, sometimes there's a student worksheet or a student book or something that the student is looking at to do their work, but the teacher is able to see everything that they need right there on their mobile device. And then all the directions that she's supposed to use to administer the assessment are right there readily available for Emma as well. In this case, she's walking Emma through a measure called nonsense word fluency, where the student is decoding. Emma's going to try to decode unfamiliar, and in this case, nonsense words, so we can really get at what she's able to do when she is presented with an unfamiliar word. She'll go through and be reminded of she'll be given exactly what she's supposed to say to the student, and then there's actually a practice that the student will go through as well. And then they'll go on and they will be ready to start the measure. So this is definitely not paper pencil. She's able to document everything her student, Emma, is saying. Mrs. MacArthur is able to go through and mark errors. She's able to go through on the mobile device and document everything that she's saying. And so there's no paper pencil when it comes to this part. The system is also timing everything for her. All of the data is being collected for her. All of that is taken care of. So let's go back. Our myth was teacher administered assessment, observational assessment is administered via paper pencil. And I think we debunked that myth. So that is definitely not. It is critical that we believe it's critical that you're observing the child, listening to them, watching them as they interact with text, but that we provide educators, mCLASS provides educators with what they need to collect that data that they're observing in an easy way. So then that leads us to myth number 2, which is teacher administered assessment is time consuming and inefficient. So I want to go to why, how I need to debunk that myth. Is that the right word, you guys? Debunk? Yeah, let's go with that. We're going to debunk that myth now. So each of the measures on mCLASS is based off of DIBELS 8th edition. If you don't know much about DIBELS and the new DIBELS 8th edition, you can Google that or go to the University of Oregon and get a ton of information about DIBELS 8th, and we can also provide you with literature on that as well. But the DIBELS 8th measures that are available on mCLASS to be administered on the mCLASS platform are all 1-minute measures. They're very quick and intended to be a quick screener of risk, but getting at a level of detail that we'll talk about in just a moment. So I won't go too much into that, but these are very quick measures. When you look at that, I want you to think about typically, let's think about whenever you have a computer administered assessment where a student is on a computer. A lot of times those assessments take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour, several times a year. And you know, you can do that. You can have one child on a computer. You can have a whole class of kiddos on a computer. So it can take anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes per student, but sometimes that is per class, depending on how readily accessible technology is for you. When you think about with 1-minute measures and how much time that takes, it's on average anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes per student, which is basically one literacy block. You know, in the younger grades, we definitely are going to want to split that up, but I think the power behind teacher administered and collecting observable data in this way is your students are still working. So you can be collecting and listening to a child, screening them for risk, and then your other students are out working and engaging in learning activities, and you're not losing any of their time, their instructional time. So just to reiterate, like I just showed you, when it comes to inefficiency and being time consuming, all Mrs. MacArthur had to do was follow those step-by-step instructions to assess efficiently and with fidelity. And I'll show you that just one more time, but just to show you, reiterate how quick this is. mCLASS will kind of take the guesswork out of it so that you're not having to go and search for administration rules or find forms and things like that. Everything is going to be readily accessible on the mCLASS platform for Mrs. MacArthur to access. And she's able to click through with ease. Okay, any questions about the first 2 myths? Okay, keep trucking along then. Myth number 3, teacher administered or observational assessment can't be adaptive. So, you know, one of the I think great things that we're blessed with as educators in this day and age is that technology has allowed us to be very smart and agile in the information that we have about our student learning, and adaptivity allows us to really take a pathway, you know, make sure that students are being challenged, but those that are not needing to be challenged, that they're supported. And when it comes to assessment, being able to adapt really can help us go down and up in a way that allows us to gather the right information about our students at the right time. And so this is a myth that I want to debunk as well. So if the myth is teacher administered assessment can't be adaptive because it's observational and more static than that, that is a myth. So with DIBELS 8th on the mCLASS platform, there are discontinue and gating rules that allow for certain benchmark measures depending on performance to be adjusted. This does minimize time on assessment, meaning we don't want to make a student, if they are not performing on a certain skill, and we know there's more challenging skills than that, and just because they're in a certain grade level, we don't necessarily want to force them into those measures if they're struggling. And the same to go the other way. If you have a student that is not struggling, we want to keep pushing them forward and get as much information as we can possibly have, no matter of the time of year or grade level, with a couple of nuances there. And so those gating rules help us determine what a starting skill, what a foundational skill would be, and if they perform poorly, then we don't advance them. But if they score high enough, then they don't have to complete other components either, but we can push them on to other things. So let me give you a couple of examples here to walk through this. Here's an example for kindergarten, beginning of year. The gating measure is what we call it, but it's PSF, phoneme segmentation fluency. It's a Dibble's eighth measure. It's administered, it's a 1-minute measure administered like Mrs. MacArthur did for Emma that I just showed you. So that particular measure has some students, they're given a word and they are telling you the sounds that they hear in that word. It's a completely auditory task. All students at kindergarten beginning of year will be taking that measure. Those that score at a certain cut point will be pushed on to take 2 additional measures. In this case, nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. Here's another example. We have grade 1 at the middle of year and end of the year. They're going to take a measure called nonsense word fluency. And if they score a certain way, then it's going to push them back to take 2 additional measures, phoneme segmentation fluency and letter naming fluency. So that gating measure, whatever it may be, will really determine, depending on their score there, whether they go forwards or backwards. You can give all the measures depending on your screening requirements that you have in your state. As we do in Texas, we have some really unique screening requirements. You have the ability to administer all the measures if you choose to do those, or if you have screening requirements, but these gating measures will support us in being quote unquote adaptive, which is a pretty incredible thing. So just a reminder here, though, that's a lot to remember. That's a lot for an educator to remember. And in the past, you would have to remember all of those rules and how to make sure that you discontinue at a certain time. But again, with mCLASS, mCLASS does that for our educators. Just because the assessment is teacher administered does not mean that they're having to remember all of these different rules and mechanisms. mCLASS is going to prompt them and allow them to make those decisions, but give them the guidance that they need to know when it's time to discontinue or when it's time to move forward. So myth number 4 then is teacher administered assessment does not provide instant data. So let's go back to Mrs. MacArthur. And at the beginning of the year, 3 weeks in the school year, Mrs. MacArthur was provided with that immediate feedback and instant data analysis for each student, not only Emma, but each student in her class. So she was able to focus immediately on what Emma was needing. She was able to also track and progress monitor Emma throughout the year and have instant feedback on the growth that she's able to make. She's able to see at a glance who is at risk in her class, who's at risk for overall reading difficulty, but also who is at risk for dyslexia. And she's able to see that data just as soon as she is done and she's done with the assessment. So let me show you what this would look like a little bit. Let's show you what Mrs. MacArthur was able to see. I'll give you a scenario here. She has 25 kids in her class. First couple weeks of school, she started working with each of the students, taking 3 or 4 minutes to assess each of them. And as she was doing that, all of her data in the mCLASS system was updating automatically. So let's say the first time she assessed some students, she was able to get 10 of her students completed. She would automatically be able to see that data that day. There's no wait time. It's immediate. And then as soon as she's done assessing all of her students, she can see her entire class summary, like the one I just pulled up on the screen. So let's walk through a couple of details here. So this is Mrs. MacArthur's benchmark. So depending on your screening requirements, most school districts screen students for risk 3 times a year: beginning of year, middle of year, end of year, and then progress monitor throughout. But we're going to look at benchmark data. So for Mrs. MacArthur, this would have been we've been talking about at the beginning of the year. She was able to see what Emma was able to do and her skill. So in this case, at the benchmark time of year, we're able to see a class summary. And it's at a glance, I'm able to see, or Mrs. MacArthur would be able to see how many students are overall at risk, well below the benchmark cutoff, below benchmark, at benchmark, or above benchmark. So this is she has 14 students assessed at this time, and so I'm able to see the breakdown of risk levels for my students. I'm not only able to see that for overall risk, but if you notice here, I'm also able to see that by reading skill, basic foundational literacy skill. So I'm able to see for letter sounds, who in my class is at risk for identifying individual letter sounds, who in my class is at risk for decoding, who is at risk for reading sight words, who is having trouble with reading fluency, and as equally as important as that, who is not having trouble with that, and what do I need to do with them? So I'm able to see a lot of data. Again, it's instantaneous. So we're debunking that myth that teacher observed, teacher administered assessment doesn't give you that immediate feedback and data. Mrs. MacArthur had it all at her fingertips. I'm going to go a little bit further here. And then I'm able to see, Mrs. MacArthur was able to see that for every student in her class also. So up here, I'm able to see, I'm not going to scroll too fast because I don't want anybody to get motion sick, but up here, I'm able to see my class summary. And then as I go down just a little bit, I'm able to see my class and each student in my class as well. So here's Emma that we've been talking about, Mrs. MacArthur. I'm able to see a couple of all of the students in my class. Again, I'm able to see who overall is at a certain level of risk. And then I'm able to break that down and see for my individual students, what are the reading skills that they are struggling with? Is it decoding? Is it word reading? Is it letter sounds? Is it comprehension? What key area are they struggling with? So I'm able to just get a ton of data instantaneously for each of my students and for my class as a whole. Additionally, I'm able to see, I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes to read through a little bit here, but let's start with Emma. So when I go to the instruction tab of my reports, I'm able to see Emma's specific data. This is how Mrs. MacArthur knew so much about Emma. Again, she administered those assessments. It took her about 4 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes for Emma, depending on the student, but anywhere there's a range, but about 4 minutes, let's say, for Emma. Mrs. MacArthur administered those assessment measures on the mCLASS platform on a mobile device, and then she was immediately able to see for Emma, here's Emma's reading patterns. Emma's having difficulty with final letters. She's reading accurately, but slow. She's struggling with vowel combinations. She's struggling with multisyllabic words. I'm able to then click on each of these, and I'm able to see a list of activities that could be used to support Emma to close that gap. So remember the action gap. We want the good, strong research and practice and data that we have to filter down into action, because we want to close that gap. Emma's at risk. We don't want her to be at risk any longer, because we know the longer it takes, the harder it's going to be to close that trajectory and get her on a pathway towards reading success. And so all of this data and these instructional activities and suggestions are intended to help Mrs. MacArthur close the action gap and take action for her students. I want to show you as well a couple of things. So there's not only that for Emma individually, but Emma also will be put into a group, a recommended small group for instruction. These small group recommendations are focused on their data. So after you get all the data for lots of students in your class, or Mrs. MacArthur was able to do that, she's then able to get recommendations for small groups. This particular small group doesn't have Emma in it, but it has a couple other students that are in Emma's class that Mrs. MacArthur teaches. So take just a second and look over and read through what you're seeing on the screen, because it's a lot for me to read about, but focus in particular over here on what is being recommended for instructional, an instructional focus for students in this group, and then their reading patterns. So it's pretty detailed is what I'm trying to get at. Mrs. MacArthur was able to see that students in this group are needing support with reading words with R-controlled spelling patterns. While the measures that are administered are brief 1-minute measures, this is the level of detail that mCLASS allows data analysis to happen at. These measures allow for us to know this much about the instruction that our students are needing to close their gaps. Mrs. MacArthur is able to know that this group needs to be working on consonant digraph spelling patterns, that they need to be working on diphthongs in isolation and in context. There's just a ton of detailed information instructionally. And then we're going to provide Mrs. MacArthur with those activities, instructional activities, for her to utilize as a jumping off point for instruction or for intervention. So I want to go back over here. And I kind of touched on this one. And so I want to take a little bit of time and make sure there's no questions here, but I sort of already debunked this one, but I want to reiterate it. Myth number 5. One of the myths that I do hear a lot of times is that teacher administered assessments, observational assessments, can't measure skills at a granular enough level for data to be instructionally impactful. And I think we just debunked that, but just to reiterate, mCLASS will provide the data that Mrs. MacArthur needs or other teachers need at the skill level to precisely support Emma in her instruction. So I will jump in here. You saw all the reports, but let me go through just one more time and just illustrate the level of granularity that the mCLASS measures through Dibble's 8th edition is able to get at. So this is an example of nonsense word fluency. One of the measures that's administered, it takes 1 minute to administer it at these different grade levels, but you're able to see the complexity of how these measures grow and the skill coverage. So, we start off in the lower grades covering CVC, E words, using the silent E, and then we get up into these really robust patterns. CVC, CVCC, and you can see through the forms that are utilized, the complexity of the words, which allows us to get at that level of depth that you just saw in the reports over here, where we're able to say, these are the specific things that you could work on with these particular groups of students to close gaps. Myth number 6, this is our last one, and then we're going to do some Q&A. So myth number 6 is it's never okay to put a child on a computer for assessment or instruction. Okay. And I say that's a myth because I know I get asked this question a lot. And, I always start with, there's nothing that can replace the power of an educator in a classroom. And we started this webinar with looking at the Eiffel Tower, and sometimes the ability to observe, especially if you have questions that are in your head, being able to observe really help clear up those questions. But it absolutely is okay to use technology to help support us in our jobs as educators, right? And so the way that mCLASS focuses this, or talks about this myth of it's never okay to put a kid on a computer. That is absolutely not what we're saying here. But we do strongly believe that observation is, mCLASS believes that observation is a great way to understand, especially with struggling readers, to understand really what they're struggling with. And having a teacher administer those measures is very, very telling. And so we want to support teachers in doing that efficiently and effectively without taking tons of time away from the instruction that it needs to be happening in the classroom. But mCLASS does enable your other educators to do that flexibly. Skills that don't require production, that don't have to be observed. For instance, like rapid naming or vocabulary. Those are a couple of measures that that can be computer administered for different reasons. We just always go back to what is developmentally appropriate. If you have a struggling reader, if they're not a struggling reader, and you believe that you can get great data by having them use a computer to assist in that data gathering effort, then go for it. And like I said, the research really says to determine overall risk, you're good to go, whether you're administering on a computer or administering observationally. But if you are wanting to really get down to what to do instructionally, what you want to know about the skills, there's nothing like being able to watch kids read and be able to know what to do with them instructionally. And observational teacher administered data is going to help you do that. And especially for those students that you are concerned about risk, like dyslexia, a specific level of reading risk like dyslexia, nothing can replace you being able to observe some of the behaviors that are being administered as a child is trying to work through reading tasks. So in a nutshell, to debunk that one, administered online is appropriate if a student at certain points. And so our recommendation is let's do teacher administered for K1 in the lower grade levels, as we're really trying to uncover who is at risk, because those are our critical time slots to identify early levels of risk. And then students in the upper grade levels that are not performing proficiently, they would be ones that you would still want to listen to them read and do a teacher administered assessment, while others, there are options to have a student complete their assessments online, interacting with the computer. Additionally, one of the other things that we do support, mCLASS supports, is online. There's some really, we're just making huge strides, I think, across the nation in determining ways that technology can help us support our students instructionally. And so with mCLASS data places students into Amplify Reading, which is an online adaptive curriculum that places students into a game-like environment to work on their skills. So not only when the teacher is working with a student, Mrs. MacArthur, for instance, was armed with the data and the tools that she needed to support Emma, but she also, when she's not with Emma and working with another small group of students like the ones we saw on this sheet when she was working with Bob and Philip and Henry and so forth, she can make sure that Emma is being supported through Amplify Reading as well. Emma will engage in these games, and then Mrs. MacArthur is able to see what she's doing. So she's able to see while Emma was playing the games and working through the online curriculum, where is she having trouble? So for instance, this isn't Emma, but we can pretend like it is. She's having some issues with, or I'm going down here to this other student, she's having some issues in the online curriculum with early decoding. And she knows that because there's a red triangle there, which indicates to Mrs. MacArthur, Emma's not getting past this, even in the online curriculum. And so I need to be able to do something about that. So there are absolutely additional huge insights that educators can have by collecting that data in a really immersive environment for the student as well. So that is, I want to wrap the myths. I hope that those myths were sort of a way for us to dive into what it means to administer teacher-administered assessments, and ultimately the power of observation, of teacher observation. But I want to take the next few minutes and answer any questions that you guys have. So if you want to pop those either into the chat or put them into the Q&A, I'm happy to answer as many as I possibly can here over the next couple of minutes, and then we will wrap up a bit early. So one of the questions that we do have is around fees and licensing and training for using mCLASS. mCLASS does there are associated fees and licensing. There's a couple of different ways that that can be worked. And so if you will email mCLASS@amplify.com, we can provide you with the information. I don't have I'm not armed with all of that information today on the webinar, but someone can get back to you very quickly with information on pricing and what that would look like and the different licensing structures for you. So please email mclass@amplify.com and someone will be readily available to help you with that. For training, yes, there's lots of various different options for training for using mCLASS. We do, Amplify provides in-person training options. There's online training options that are self-directed. There's a more structured online learning experience, but lots of ways that are cost-effective and time-effective to make sure everybody's trained. The other thing about mCLASS is it's very intuitive, and I can say that from experience, that in general, you do need to do some training as you do with anything. Professional learning is key, but it's a very intuitive platform for educators to use. Great question. Okay, so a couple more questions. What was number 5? Susan, I knew somebody was going to ask me that, and I don't have my myths memorized yet, so I'm going to back up here real quick. Myth number 5, teacher-administered assessments can't measure skills at a granular enough level for data to be instructionally impactful. And that one, I hope I debunked by walking you through at the level of granularity that you get to whenever you're looking at the different reporting options. No problem, Susan. And if you have other specific questions, I'm happy to walk, we can take it offline and I can answer any questions, or I can find somebody to answer questions for you. There's a question, Steve put a question in there on what grade levels mCLASS covers. K6, kindergarten through 6th grade. So that I think answers that one. Okay. Hi, Libby from North Carolina. I didn't see you pop in there earlier. Hello. Okay, any other questions that I can help to answer? All right. Steve, do you have any more questions? Were you given any more? I'm not seeing any more on my end. Okay. Okay, great. So I want to wrap up today and give you guys some information on who and how you can reach out if needed. So like I said just a second ago, mclass@amplify.com is a place that you can email that email address at any time to get more information about mCLASS. We also have a phone number on your screen, and please follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well. But we're thrilled that you joined us today. We're happy to answer any questions about mCLASS and the power of observation and what that can do for your educators in order to support students in your classrooms, just like Emma. So I hope that this was informative, and please reach out with any questions and we will be happy to answer them. And I hope that you guys have a great evening, eat some dinner, and we will see you all back in schools tomorrow. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.